Welcome in to season 2 of the Fresh Flow podcast. I am Matt. He is Mitch. Mitchell, I sent you a video a little while ago, man. It's snowing in Birmingham, which is not a good thing. People are going to lose their minds here. It's an everyday thing for you, but there's going to be no milk and no bread when I go to the grocery store on the way home.
Well, the interesting thing here is that if you looked at the weather map, it's actually just like this lightning bolt that goes across the middle of the country and actually missed us too. So
Missed us too?
So are you guys telling me that it's snowing in Birmingham, but not in Vermont and Michigan? Is that what I'm hearing?
That is correct, sir.
Yep.
Wow.
It's cold here. It's in the 1920, but
wow.
Global weirding.
All right. Perfect segue. Let me introduce our guest. We are thrilled to have a titan in our field here today, Dr. Kevin Tremper from the University of Michigan. Kevin, welcome. Thanks for joining us, man.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Man, my pleasure. So the last time I saw Kevin was at the ASA Advanced meeting in 2024. He was giving a talk, and from the podium, he was wearing his Michigan National Championship hat, fresh off a Michigan National Championship. As an Alabama fan, I had to sit in the audience, them having put us out of the playoff, and bear it. And I thought when we scheduled Kevin for this session, surely Alabama would beat you guys in the ReliaQuest Bowl, right? You had a down year, and I'll be dang if y'all didn't kick our butts again. So I'm just going to sit here in shame. I'm going to say roll tide anyway, and I'm going to say, Kevin, congrats on absolutely dominating Bama.
Yeah, and Ohio State, and messing up the whole rest of the season.
Is that still a successful season, though, if you beat Ohio State and beat Bama?
State and Michigan State and Alabama, no matter if that's the only wins, it's success.
It's the only thing that matters.
Keeps his job. There's no doubt about that.
By the time this thing airs, I suspect that Ohio, you'll be able to say that we beat the eventual national champions. That's the way.
So we actually are the champs then.
That's right. That's right. You're right. All right. Well, again, thanks for being here. And let's just start with, good grief, you were a chairman at Michigan for a long, long time. And that seemingly just doesn't happen much anymore. How did you do it? And give us some reflections on your decades of being chair up at Michigan.
I was chair at Irvine, and so it was 35 years of being chair. And with no background, no knowledge, I really feel like the Forrest Gump of department chairs. I got the job because the chair there left. There was a vote among the faculty, and I wasn't not even board certified, but they voted me in because most of the faculty were young. And over the past 30 years, I've come up with, first of all, a chair job is a great job. I think it's a phenomenal job. And the best thing about it is you're helping careers. And it's like you have 100 kids or more, and then you're watching them and helping them get along in life. So it's good fun. You have to be willing to be head of the complaint department. And you take complaints as sort of little challenges. And after you've been chair for a while, they say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. You see the same kind of complaints. Oh, yeah, I know that one with a little twist. So you get easier at them. And the fun part about these things is you just fix them on the spot. The autonomy of a department chair is great, that you can fix things. And that part is really rewarding. And with that, I have 10 random thoughts I thought I'd give you. These are the random thoughts of somebody who's been wandering around this job trying to survive. One, good things in public, bad things in private. So all the kudos go out in email, anything that could possibly, in any microscopic way, be construed by anybody as negative, don't send it to anybody. You talk to them in the room in private. Second, when there are problems, contact your boss. Whoever you are, my boss would be the dean and sometimes the lawyer, but whoever you're reporting to, if something bad or weird is happening, they don't want to hear it from somebody else. The sooner they know it, the better. So contact them. This goes 7 days a week. I call the dean on weekends and say, hey, there's a little weird thing. It may come around and you may hear about it. This is what it is, and this is what I'm doing. Second, these aren't in any order. Third is keep expectations low.
That's what I do with Mitch every time we log on to one of these.
Keep them low. If you want to exceed expectations, whatever people think, if you exceed it, you're a good guy, no matter how bad they were, the expectations are low. Keep them low and realistic. When you deal with a hospital, margin makes the mission. So I've consulted with a number of department chairs who are negotiating with their hospital, and they tell them that they're not negotiating for support or subsidy or handout. It's a business. It's a service agreement. They want the services, they got to pay for it. Radiology says they want care for a pediatric MRI. You're not asking for that job. If they want you to do it, they got to pay for the cost of things that don't pay for themselves. I always offer them, hey, you can go to our local private group, see if they want to do it. But it's a service agreement. It's just business. It's not a charity. You're running a business, they're running a business. For the faculty, I always say the fun is during the days and weekdays. The fun of teaching, the fun of cases. The irritation is nights and weekends. So your compensation plan should follow that people get paid for being at night and working late. CMS and Blue Cross don't care what your rank is. They don't care, right? So the difference between an instructor at Michigan and a full professor is $20,000 a year. There's only a $20,000 difference between the lowest rank and the highest rank. Now you get credit for time, but promotions are based on academics and you get time, and kudos for that. Poor judgment deserves a second chance. Poor integrity does not. At the physician level, if there's an integrity problem, I show them the door. No second chances. I mean, you should have integrity at that point. Screw-ups happen to everybody. I know my buddy Mike O'Reilly, who you may know, was at our place for 15 years and is currently going to his retirement party at Apple right now. He's going to retire next week. But when he first worked at Apple, and then he went over to work at Stanford during Fridays, he said, wow, Apple's tough. At Stanford, I can even kill somebody if I don't do it on purpose and lie about it or make a habit of it, I'm okay. In Apple, you can get thrown down, they're serious. But no, integrity is the basis of all of our fields of medicine. The hardest one for chairs is no special deals. Don't have any secret agreement special deals. You can have open deals, more academic time for productivity, more academic support, but not special deals. They grow like a plague within a department. And any new chair coming into the department, they'll find out there's a host of special deals. And the people that have the deals aren't going to raise their hand and say, hey, you can't take away my special deal. So since they can't say that, they'll just try to trash the new chair. So I warn them that that's going to happen. And again, I said service agreements with the hospital. And the final thing is smile. Smile. When you're walking down the halls in the hospital and you're the chair of the department and you've got some terrible thing you're worried about and a faculty walks by and they see you frowning, they think it's them. They think it's them. It might seem crazy, but they think it's them. Their day is messed up. Oh my gosh, you didn't even say hi. What'd I do? Oh man, I still have a job? I don't check my badge. So those are my, I guess, words of wisdom. At least
At your institution, it is you. It is your fault.
It is my fault. I mean, I just wanted to echo what Kevin said just about no special deals. When I onboard my clinical directors, the people that run the operating rooms, what I tell them is, number one, I'm going to teach you every way I screwed up, because you're going to screw up in different ways. Well, there we go. And then the other piece is that every decision that you make, just make sure you make it the same way every time. Because this way, when somebody asks you why you made an assignment the way you did, you don't have to think about it because you've done it the same way every time, right? And when you're able to do that, it builds this thing. We've talked about this in the past, but transparency builds trust, and trust builds culture. And if you don't have that very beginning of trust, you're never going to build a culture. And I would argue, and I would add, that everything that you've talked about, Kevin, is about building culture. And I think that's a leader's job, right? And here's the hard part for doctors to understand. You don't know that you led until you leave, right? And when people carry on what you believed was important, you led because you taught somebody the way you thought things should be done. So kudos to you, Kevin.
If you're embarrassed about something, don't do it. If it's a mistake, just fess up. But if you intentionally are doing something, wow, I sure hope nobody hears about this. Everybody will hear about it.
Yep.
No, there's no real secrets. Everybody hears about it. In fact, I was going to do a study. I haven't done this, but I was going to post something on our web and email everybody. And then I was going to spread a rumor about something and say, don't tell anybody, and see how long one would go around in microseconds. The other one's a new policy. Everybody will ignore it. But so juicy secrets spread very quickly. So
it's like the modern day Martin Seligman experiment, right? How fast does
so I
travel?
could go on and on because I'm an old guy. But the other thing is my personal trek through this is pretty bizarre. That's why Mike O'Reilly and I both say we're kind of the Forrest Gumps of anesthesia. How did this possibly happen? Should I go through this?
Yes, and I will say that Forrest Gump played at Alabama. Let's don't forget that.
I'm a PhD student in Berkeley in chemical engineering, going to make a career making gasoline. Seemed like something useful then. This was in early 1970s. I had a project required for the PhD program because the projects were all funded and you did what you were told to do in the lab. And they said, you must propose and defend original research that has nothing to do with what you've ever done before or what you're doing for your PhD. Something totally different. Make up your own question and then present it to a committee of 3 faculty that are knowledgeable in that area. So I walked down to the life sciences library at the downhill side of Berkeley, wandered through the library, and I ran into something that was a model of tissue perfusion by a famous South African guy, physiologist. And I thought there were some simple errors or assumptions that didn't have to be made. Basically, I said, well, you can solve what they're doing by using mathematics. I mean, they didn't use math. They used postulated mechanisms that help things diffuse and reacted in tissue. So I proposed this model that involved diffusion and chemical reaction, cylindrical coordinates for tissue. So it was a sort of a mathematical model or something. But the important part is they picked a guy to be on the advisory board, was a mechanical engineer, kind of early bioengineer, who developed the soft contact lens. His name was Fat. And he developed a polymer that had optical properties, but also diffusion properties enough that oxygen could diffuse through the polymer fast enough to keep the cornea alive. So to do that, he had to measure oxygen in the eye. To measure oxygen in the eye, he got a colleague at UC San Francisco who got him these little small oxygen electrodes. And he talked to me about the interest I had in that. And if you were interested, you may consider going to medical school if you wanted to apply that. He felt that he did all this work, but it was the ophthalmologist that stuck the thing in the eye that got the credit, even though he did years of basic work on this. And he introduced me to a guy that I thought was an engineer or some kind of chemist or something. It turns out he was a doctor. It turned out he was an anesthesiologist. His name was John Seringhouse. I didn't know what an anesthesiologist was. I had no idea. I had no idea who this guy was. I was actually talking to probably the greatest living anesthesiologist in the world. 8 years earlier, he invented the blood gas machine. Of course, the CO2 is the Seringhouse electrode inside. And he told me, and Irfad said, we really need a way to continuously monitor oxygen non-invasively. And if you're interested in engineering applied to medicine, you may think of working on that. So I was handed from the probably the most respected guy in clinical research and technology and medicine, the idea of going in and working on non-invasive oxygen monitoring. And that helped me get into UC Irvine Medical School's NIH grant there on monitoring oxygen through the skin. And I worked on that. So that is part A. Part B, I wanted to study this in patients, and the easiest thing to do was study in critical care patients. What I also lucked out on is because I was old and had a graduate degree, I got out of medical school a year early. And I took that year to work with a trauma surgeon who is one of the founders of critical care. He's actually the original editor of critical care medicine, Will Shoemaker. He had me working at the county hospital in LA called Harbor General. Are you familiar with LA at all? We called it the Harvard of Torrance. It was a knife and gun club, lots of business.
I think they took care of Tiger
speaking.
Woods a couple years ago.
Yeah, he took care. I know it's a great trauma center. He supposedly developed the paramedics there through the fire department of LA. He had a ICU, 10-bed trauma ICU that was his laboratory. Every patient in the unit got an A-line and a PA catheter, 100%. Had hemodynamic variables measured every couple hours all day. The beginning of the day, everyone had radiotagged albumin blood volume measured every day. I never heard of that before. I thought it was a standard in critical care when I went to UCLA and say, where's the blood volume? They looked at me cross-eyed. So they had this data sheet with about 40 variables, everyone in left ventricular stroke cardiac index, of course, everything. And I stuck my oxygen monitor on. He said, well, you can study this, we'll just add another row to this line of variables. And you can and I stayed there as a fellow for a year and a half after my internship. And I just helped get the swans in so the research techs could do all this monitoring stuff. Now, this clipboard that everybody wrote all the numbers on went to a guy in the basement who typed it into a computer. And then we got this computer readouts every day, and we'd give them to the surgical team. And this was part of a randomized trial on outcomes. So the reason that I'm going through this long story is I always thought, geez, we've got these digital numbers coming out of the HP monitors, and then we put them on paper and then we put them to a digital computer. It seems like, why don't we just go from A to B instead of A to B to C? So fast forward, I'm at Irvine as chair. I get a letter to apply for the job at Michigan. And unbeknownst to me, that they'd had a failed search and they were really pissed, and it took 5 years to restart it again. So they were willing to say yes to almost everything. And so I asked for everything. I asked for everything I can imagine. A great model for a positive cash flow. And the last at the bottom of the list was, I would like to have an electronic system, build, buy, or develop an electronic system that would take data from the anesthesia monitors and put it onto a record so that we don't do these little paper check dot things. And the hospital director said, why? And I explained why. He said, sure, okay, how much it cost? And I said, well, I don't know. There aren't really any around, but there was one called CompuRecord that wasn't comprehensive enough, and it didn't have H&P data in high enough pick listed resolution. We wanted to figure, well, the H&P is where all the decisions start. So we had to have a fields for all the organ systems. And I was in Michigan about 3 years, and I recruited a guy named Mike O'Reilly from Vermont. And he was studying sepsis in rats. And he got it going in the lab. The rats were dying. It wasn't working out. He's kind of depressed. I said, dump the rats. I need somebody to help me with this project. I've got the money for it, and I hadn't gotten a chance to get started. So we'll start this project. Go to more care, Michigan operating room care. He says, perfect. It's Mike O'Reilly care. It was meant for me. So we set up an RFP. We sent it out, and we got several companies requesting. So the first one we selected lasted for about a week. They were totally vaporware. We said they don't know what they're doing. They have some undergrad student doing their software for them. The second one was a company called Marquette Electronics, which was the big physiologic monitor company, later purchased by GE. And we said, and they made fetal monitoring system. And they said, well, we can use our fetal monitoring software people to make an anesthesia because it's kind of similar. Little wiggly lines versus your ... Well, we worked with them for 2 years. Did not work. Literally, soap per sales year. The first question they asked, well, anybody born before 1984? I said, very likely. They said, well, why would you ask those? Well, that's when we started our fetal system. So we'll fix that. A year and a half later, they had way more fixes that they had to do than anyone said. So we had a trial separation and divorce. It's not working out. So we switched and we went to this little teeny startup company in Ann Arbor. It was only 5 people. 2 years later, it was 8 people. They'd done several projects in Michigan, and they'd done several other hospitals. So we met with them and we said, this is what we want. We'll pay you $100,000 if you make this what we want. But we're not going to pay anything until we see it working in the OR. We want an H&P, everything. Valuations of residents, everything. And we met you probably heard this story, I don't know. We met every Saturday morning in a coffee shop with Vic Caterpal, who was the president of this small company, and his younger brother, Sachin, who was the programmer. And so we'd meet on Saturday. Monday morning, it would be in there. We'd check it out Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Next Saturday, we did round and round, did that for almost 2 years. Lots of cappuccinos. 6 months into it, we realized that Sachin, the programmer, during the day was a medical student in Michigan. So he was nighttime, daytime, weekend programmer, medical student on the ride. Anyway, so we finally got it implemented. 99, 2000 was pretty much implemented throughout the department. GE bought the company called SEC, and they changed it to Centricity, the product. Sachin got an MBA, worked with GE for 5 years. Vic worked with him about 2 or 3 years, and he spun off and got another company that he's doing great with. I don't know if you know Sachin, you all know Sachin, right? So Sachin, I think, became his boss's boss in about less than a year. He really got this MBA, programmer, clinician, well-spoken guy. They thought, this guy's going places. So they had him flying all over the world with acquisitions of this and that. He shows up at my office one day and says, I don't like my job. He said, I want to be an anesthesiologist. So we bring him back and say, here's a residency and here's a job. same day. I said, this guy is going to be a star, no doubt about it. So he was our first intern. Back then you started in the PG2 year. So we're thinking of having internship. So he was our test pilot for internship. It was basically a surgery internship, because that's what I had. I thought everybody should do surgery internship. He did that. Now we come to MPOG on this run-on story. So Sachin as a resident, and I and Mike and others started to do observational studies on virtually everything. It was like a candy store for clinical research. We had a database with fully high-resolution comorbidities, all pick listed in every field. So we could query for preoperative, postoperative, and intraoperative care. And so we started, if you look at between 2003 and 7, I don't know how many papers we published, but it must have been 40. We're just publishing because we had access, and other departments were just getting these systems. And we not only had it, but we had complete control of it, because we had the configuration person in our department, and Sachin was there. So we can actually configure it any way we want. If we made up a study, we can add a field in one day. So it was great. So George comes, I recruit him from MGH. That's a whole other story you don't want to hear, but Warren Zapal thought George would never leave Harvard for some wasteland in the Midwest. He was trashing us. And I called Warren after I met George. I said, George is clearly a nice guy and a star. He said, Warren says, we have plans for him at Harvard. And I said, yeah, but I offered him a job, and he just bought a house. The day I offered him a job, he bought a house. He told me, they're so cheap. I said, no, this is Anna. This is Boston. You would have gotten ripped off at this. I don't know. Anyway, so he came. So then we had George and Sachin. George invites Warren Sandberg, who was at MGH, to come out as a visiting professor. And we were out to dinner, and they're all drinking fancy wine. I'm more of a Diet Coke person. And during that, I was saying, we're doing all these studies, and why don't other people do this? We should actually, why don't we just get the data together? Warren says, well, stop whining. Why don't you do it? I said, okay, I'm going to do it. So that was in September. And then I was a member of the not-so-secret society, the Wharton Society, the worst-kept secret in the field. Anyway, so we had a meeting in February, like we do each year. And I asked them, all those that had information systems, if you have an information system, and this is now 2010, if they would send a representative who's the techiest faculty member to Ann Arbor, I'd get a place for them to stay. We'd like to put on a meeting to discuss data sharing. And that was in August, I think 2011. And we had 10, 15 people there from around the country. I gave an introduction of the sort of concept. If we pool the data, we'll have a much broader database, different ways of doing things. You can't have the same way of doing things and do a very good outcome study. You got to have the opposite of controlled trials. You got to have random data so you can select the control group. After my introduction, I said, and here's Sachin. He's going to take it from there because he knows the technical aspects of this. He had finished his residency 4 weeks before that, took over the management and technical operation for the next, forever almost. I said, he asked for 3 full-time programmers. And so I said, okay, we'll fund 3 full-time programmers and time for you, and just tell me what else you need. So it took about 3 years before the first set of data came in from everywhere. And that's the end of that story.
Now, the end of the story is when Mitch gets an MPOG jacket because he's jealous of the one you're wearing
we'll
right
see
now.
if we can get these on that.
You guys can't see
we
it,
should
but it's pretty slick.
With an Alabama up here, right?
Hey, I'll take it. You can put UAB on it. You can put Alabama, either one. I'm fine with either.
I think the existential question is, what would have happened if you and Michael O'Reilly switched places in the universe, and where would you be now?
Switch places. I mean, if I were at Apple,
if you'd gone to Massimo and then to Apple, and then Mike was the chair at Michigan, so
I think Mike would have made a perfect chair.
I don't disagree.
When he took the job at Apple, there are 2 things. First, he went out to work for Massimo. You know that. I knew the guy that started Massimo. I'd done some studies with him, and he offered Mike a job as the chief medical officer. And he asked me, what do you think? And I said, well, I think Irvine's a wonderful place to live. It's the weather is perfect. If you never lived in California, it's worth a try. And if you don't like it, 1 week notice, you got your job back. with one proviso. You got to work in the OR 1 day a week. I'm not going to take somebody out of the OR for several years and then come back. You got to keep your trigger finger sharp. So I called Irvine, because I used to be the chair there, and I said, look, we got this Mike O'Reilly. He's definitely good for nothing. So if you can let him work on Fridays just in the OR so he can keep his clinical skills, that'd be a favor to him and to me. So that's what he did. He worked at Irvine. When he applied at Apple, he was the only one on the final list for this chief medical officer job for medical technology that was still clinically active. And that's one of the reasons he got the job. So when he accepted it at Apple, he said, I love this, it's great, but I have one proviso. I need to work 1 day a week at Stanford in the OR, because he wanted to make sure his clinical skills up. And that's what he did in 12 months. Before the COVID, he stopped. But Mike at Apple, he said, I want to be a consultant for medical products throughout the company, mostly the watch, but I don't want to build a group that reports to me. I don't want to have to do HR reviews. I don't want to have to go to a bunch of meetings that I'm making up or making up slideshows for you. He used to call meetings a great alternative to work. And so he said, I want meetings to go to, in Apple, they're very functional, show up on time. If you're 10 minutes late, they go, is he okay? Maybe he's in the hospital. There's nobody that's late for a meeting there. But so his career there has been phenomenal. He worked all across the company at Apple on a variety of projects, but he's never had to make any, he's never had to manage people, which is great, if you can get away with it.
So bringing back, we're starting up the second season of the podcast, and some of the things that you've mentioned about just being around the department as a chair, I think those are all important things. Has it gotten harder over time to be a chair, you think, in academic anesthesiology?
I don't think it really gets harder. It just gets a little different. When I first started, anesthesia department could survive and be very financially successful on just the revenue they generated in the OR because they only worked in the OR. The only offsite was labor and delivery. And so as the hospital and procedures expanded all over the place and requests for anesthesia services, that made all of a sudden, now they started getting into financial issues. And then the reimbursement from insurers wasn't going up enough to compensate for the low reimbursement of Medicaid and Medicare. So it's gotten financially a little harder. But I think we're still such an essential part of a hospital that writing a service agreement is understandable to most of them. They don't like it, but they don't have much of an option. They don't. So I think the problem with people accepting to go to a place and they'll offer, we'll give you $3 million for this and $4 million for that, $2 million for that, sign here. And you find out they're running $4 million a year in the red. Their operating budget is terrible, and they're trying to give you a lump sum to just get you to sign the deal. And then you find yourself 2 or 3 years later in the red and having to beg for money. If you have to beg for resources, it's only very tough. Hospital doesn't really feel that academics and anesthesia is something worth investing in. So you've got to make the deal with the hospital on purely clinical service grounds with a positive margin. There's another weird story I'm not going to go into it, but it's a football story. But
it's probably going to involve beating Alabama, so go ahead.
Probably yes, because it starts with Fielding Yost. Never heard of him. Fielding Yost was the football coach at Stanford, got fired because he wasn't an alumni. They changed the rules. He came to Michigan, the 1901-1902 season, his first 2 seasons in Michigan, unscored against, not unbeaten, unscored against for 2 years, averages 60 points a game. Nothing will ever do that. He invented the linebacker, and he was the first one to effectively use the forward pass. But what's more important, he's the first one to charge admission for a college athletic event. The president was so pissed off, he said, if you're going to charge people and you'll let local community riffraff, non-student, non-alumni to come to these events, I'm not going to give you any money. And he said, I don't want any of your money. I can run this on my own. And he built the stadium. He started the Rose Bowl, the first bowl game, he started that. East versus West. Guess who he played in the Rose Bowl? Stanford. And what was the score? 49-0. Stanford refused to come out on the field for the fourth quarter. They were too embarrassed. So he got back at them. But
if my memory serves me correctly, there is a house named after Yost on campus.
Yeah, that's where they play hockey now. But that model of in the department, when I came there, I said, how does this financially work? And they said, well, it's running. You have your revenue and you have your expenses. And I said, if money's left over, what can we do with it? He said, whatever you want. You can put in long-term fund investments in our endowment fund. And there's some rules to it. Yeah. And you can make investments. And so it's very entrepreneurial. We built part of our surgery center. We got huge margins on that. We were able to keep that money invested and invested the distribution of it. So we built a reserve that could allow us to fund our research. So that's not always the model. That's the problem with accepting it. You got to know what model that you're not going to change the system if you go into a chair job at a place. You got to find out what the system is and how you can work with that. But the hard part is getting the margin for the mission, for the academic mission.
Perfect segue. You just mentioned the model, and that brings the question with all that's going on. You've talked about the history of VIMPA going from little data to big data, all that's going on the payer side of anesthesiology. What's the future model? You recently jumped into the infinite game with Mitch and I, and we put out a paper on that about the infinite game in the UK. What does the future of anesthesiology hold, and what is the possible future model?
Yeah, you know that as much as I do. I think the idea that, well, first of all, you had podcasts with Steve Kane. You know, the problem is everybody whines to the bank. You know, anesthesiologists out of the CRNAs are so unhappy, and then they're wink, wink. Everybody is well paid. My best buddy in first day of medical school, I said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to do anesthesia. It's applied physiology, and it seems like fun. He goes, yeah, my brother's one of those and make a lot of money. And I go, really? And he was in private practice in LA. And every time there's a change, wow, they make more money. So one of the issues is people are compensated well because we're involved in high compensated, high risk procedures. So as we said, and you've said, there's some of the things we do make no sense. I mean, I got my cataracts done. I didn't want any midazolam. I got 2 eye drops, well, actually one in one eye, one in the other, a week later, from the nurse in the pre-op holding room. The CRNA that was standing there just was sitting there. So we've got a surgery center, 6 rooms every day of cataracts. We've got 8 CRNAs and 2 faculty there for standing by somebody lying on that bed is probably the safest time for most of those patients. There's more risk driving there, way more risk walking up and down stairs than lying on a table getting a cataract. And why do we do it? Because government pays for it. So the nurse that put the eye drop in my eye should have gone right to the OR with me, and there should be virtually anesthesia on call or backup or something. So if we could change the system, not based on our personal margin revenue, but what would be good for the country. Now, people would say, yeah, but we'll lose that job. I go, does anybody really want that job? I mean, seriously, a CRNA, they go 2.5 years of training, all this stuff. They're getting like MD, some sort of doctorate, whatever. They want to sit by a cataract for their life? I mean, that is painful. So we should be helping have others do the job that we don't need to do. So if everybody worked, as they say, at their highest level of training, we're going to have CRNAs doing more. Now, people think, wow, yeah, we're going to lose our jobs. I started residency, 800 graduates in my national class. 10 years later, there was 1,900. That's the year 1990. But 1,800 in 1990, 1,800, okay? This past year, I think we graduated like 1,900, maybe 2,000, 1,900. 35 years later, we're only 200 more in the graduating class. I mean, that's clearly we can't manage the work. Aging population, expanding population, procedures all over the place. We cannot do the work without other providers. You realize that. Everybody realized that. So the question is whether we need somebody else other than the CRNA for doing these procedures that we really don't need to do. But we should be helping. Like I think we've said in your paper, so we should be designing the future we want unless somebody else is going to design it around us. So if you want to lead in the change, but it's very hard. I mean, I don't think you're very popular among ASA members and the political class. They're trying to make a change.
You'll catch some arrows for saying stuff like that.
Yeah.
I'm well aware.
Yeah, I didn't say that. I'm just quoting what you said.
Yeah, right. If there's anything this podcast accomplished, it's can we please move past this notion of somebody's going to lose a job? My goodness gracious, there's so much work to do. We can't even keep up with it. Let's just take that out of the equation and all think about the future.
We brought this up. The problem is that if we can't keep up, somebody will find a way to keep up around us. We're going to be marginalized unless we lead the change. We're going to be marginalized. And that's what my fear is, because we're going, these waves of up and down and up and down is totally predictable. You know, the jump in the 80s with monitoring and technology made it an attractive field. Then in the 90s, this worry that it was going to go away, that it didn't. And then the recent problem is due to all the retirees. I'm like the geezer boomer there. I mean, most people in private practice at my age aren't working. I mean, they're going to actually do a case. I can just point at the resident to do a case. So I don't know how the average age of practitioners has got to be moving up and up. I don't know the data on that, but it's got to be moving up.
I mean, I think the 90s is a double whammy in the sense that you do have the resignation of the people in the baby boomers moving out of the workforce, right? But then we're missing that cohort behind them, the people that should be in their 50s and 60s to provide the mentorship and the guidance and the teaching and the academics. And you do need the wise individual in every department to say, hey, we've done this before, right? But we're missing sort of a decade there. You talked about MPOG, you talked about the monitoring, and Thomas Friedman's book, Thank You for Being Late, he talks about the power of superconnectivity analytic sensors, right? And in 2007 was the inflection point where we got to a point where we could make these microchip sensors really, really cheap. And so one of the examples he uses is it's GE, right? General Electric monitors every turbine jet engine in the air, right? And so it used to be root cause analysis. You figure out why something broke and then you fix it so that it doesn't happen in the future. Then you have periodic maintenance. GE is moving to this phase of predictive maintenance, right? Because they've got the sensors on the planes and they know that something's about to happen, something's about to change. How do you apply that platform to what you've seen in your career, MPOG, everything else? Because I firmly believe that MPOG is important, right? But how do we get anesthesiology as a specialty to the place where, like Google, right? Google is testing platforms every day. How do we build that so that anesthesiologists every day in this country are trying to figure out how to build a better system?
Yeah, I started a company called AlertWatch, which was sold to another company, BioIntelligence, a couple of years ago. And that started in about 2011. About the same year, I drew a little picture sketch and took it to the engineering school to make a mock-up of what is now AlertWatch about the same time that we started MPOG. And the theory there was, let's copy what aviation's done. They seem to be about 25 years ahead of us, and they're really interested in safety. I mean, as we say, the pilot has enlightened self-interest, on make sure the plane doesn't crash. And that was to be able to, I'd call that AlertWatch, I'd call it I, not AI, just I, use the stuff that we know we should do and alert people at the time that they could do it. Not telling them in a QA report a month later, hey, by the way, you missed on this hyperglycemia, or your average mean blood pressure was under 60 for 25 minutes. Tell them when there is time to change the course in the middle of the course. I think it was a great idea. There's a thing in business called the value proposition that got in the way. If you want to sell something, if I'm the buyer at the hospital, I say, well, I'll buy this thing, but you got to show me what don't I buy, or who do I fire? I actually wrote an editorial on that for ANA about 10 years ago when they were trying to demonstrate desferrine could wake you up 2 minutes quicker than Tiva. It was a Frank Dexter mathematical statistical study that I could never understand the math or stats, but I couldn't understand the idea if you save 2 minutes a case on 5 cases, so you save 10 minutes. It's like you have 9 dads, you can make a baby every month. It doesn't work. So you can't put the pieces together. They're worth nothing. So I wrote an editorial. Blake Rosen asked me to write an editorial. And the title was, who are you going to fire? We buy stuff and we pay salaries. So if you're going to save money, you have to have less salaries or lower salaries. Nobody's putting their hand up. You don't need me. So whether AI at some point, where does it save money? Now, improving care, I think it can, but that's a hard proof because most of the people do okay. Even if we do so-so care, even if they're underhydrated, or maybe if they had blood pressure low, they get a little bump in troponin that lasts for like a day. Okay, statistically, it's not good, but nobody knows. So I think the value proposition is, can that improve the efficiency of care somehow? Now, if I hear one more thing about turnover time, I'll put a gun to my head. I mean, seriously. On time starts, and
You're speaking Mitch's love language here.
yeah, look at the snap board and look at all the holes in your schedule because the surgeons aren't available then. I understand it. They have clinic, they have cases, they have vacations too. Believe it or not, they have vacations every once in a while. I think they're entitled to that. But the snap board, I think Alex Evers did a study that if we eliminated turnover time, made it zero, patient left the room, the other one was in the room, we would still have 70% of the unused time there. We would only gain 25% there because of all the block time things. And you try to fit all these pieces of scheduling together in the duration of a case, especially in an academic center, because the cases are longer, more difficult with a lot of, we're going to do this and possibly this and possibly that and possibly this and possibly that. So they don't know what it's going to, especially cancer cases. So it's hard to schedule it. So I don't know how AI will do that. Maybe it can improve our scheduling. Yeah. I mess up on first time starts because the patient say, can I see my family? Oh, no, you can't see your family before you go back to the OR. No way. We're got to be on time, and our time starts within 10 minutes of 7:30, you fail. If we go add 5 more minutes, like 85% or 90% are there. So it's just a total fallacy. So that won't say, but I think adding I followed by AI, and I think that MPOG can help with the data, clearly has the data resources to be able to develop large AI models for answering the questions that we think will make the difference. Will people close loop? Will it happen? Sure. I mean, it's going to happen sometime. I mean, the planes can fly by themselves now. I don't know how many people would get into it on a commercial plane if no one was there. I mean, that would be, military is going to be, they said the last military pilot's already been born. So I don't know whether that's going to happen. But in commercial aviation, we're going to have quite a few years of driverless cars before they go to driverless, no pilot in there at all. That's a little.
If I board a plane and don't see a pilot and co-pilot sitting up there, I'm
Even if
turning
they're
the other way,
sleeping,
man.
they could be, somebody could wake them up anyway. So I would think that'll be tough. So I like with us, how do we do that? I mean, we can have, I think, better care, right? We could have very tightly controlled blood pressure and volume and glucose. These things can all be tightly controlled, and that will probably make a difference in outcome.
I think Friedman, he called it not AI, but IA, sort of what you're saying here, intelligence assistance, right? How do we, because we know that humans alone, AI alone, they don't make a better decision than AI plus human, right? And I think Kasparov had a similar quote showing the benefits of taking the two technologies and figuring out how to make it work.
I think there's most of these, exactly what you said, there's basically clinical physiologic knowledge and logic that when applied to large databases can make it refined. I mean, we did a study in Michigan trying to predict who will need intubation within 24 hours during the COVID by parameter. They put in 40 trillion parameters, and I talked to them. They talked to me, and I said, well, why don't you put in their SpO2 to FiO2 ratio? Because when somebody tells me the SAT's 95, I go, that's pretty good. They said they're on 10 liters. Oh, that's terrible, So that ratio was by far the two things that produce the outcome predictor. That ratio and their age. So these were not, now they had all the others added little teeny bits to it, but the two things that were just pretty common sense. If you're older, you better watch out. And if you're leading lots of high flow oxygen to keep your SAT in the 90s, that's a problem. So I don't know how many examples will be of that. I have a friend who's a cardiologist, and he was asked to review a paper with AI where they were predicting AFib in patient population. They take their EKG, no AFib history, no history at all, and this model would supposedly say this person is at high risk of developing AFib. And he was the reviewer, and he goes, well, what were the major indicators in that waveform analysis? And the answer was, we don't have any idea. We don't have any idea. He said, okay, so you're going to publish this and you have no idea, but you say that people are more likely to get AFib. Yep. So I think that's where we're going to get. I mean, if there's an update, that there may be things that we would not be able to see.
Well, Matt likes to see a pilot. I read somewhere that Google, they're testing their self-driving cars, but they still put a human in the driver's seat just so that somebody thinks that the human's driving the car, right? And ultimately, that going back to our specialty, that is medicine is a humanities. We're a liberal arts. That patient-physician relationship's the basis of what we do, and it is a privilege, right?
It is a privilege. It is a privilege.
How do you take that technology and make us better? How do we build different systems so that we can do more? I think that is where our specialty really, really needs to go. Dr. Tremper, who are you going to call? What are you going to do next?
Who am I going to call? What am I going to do next? Well, I know that going from who's who to who's he has been great. I highly recommend Life After Chair is actually a blessing in disguise. As a chair, you accumulate meetings that are very irritating and go into the night. And now I get the privilege you talked about. I get to go to the OR. I meet patients, help them get relaxed, help them get through something that's scary, wake them up and see them in the PACU and have them smiling that they're awake. So I think actually practicing clinical anesthesia is an incredible privilege, and I really enjoy it. Who am I going to call with respect to, I'm not sure how to answer who am I going to call.
Just say Ghostbusters.
Yeah, probably one of the greatest movies of all time. Seriously. That little cards with the wavy lines, that was an actual study done at Yale, an actual study with the cards and the electric shocks. So there's some real science behind that movie. I call Mike O'Reilly. We have coffee every morning, and we debate about all these things, how we're going to change the world. I go, yeah, well, we're running out of time. We're not.
Well, when you get a chance, the next time you have coffee, let Mike know that you did this podcast recently with these two chumps, Matt and Mitch. Maybe he should think about it.
And that he should do it next.
Yes, and announcement, he is just got engaged.
Oh, man.
Linda Polly, who was our head of OB anesthesia, who's head of SOAP for years, retired OB anesthesiologist. They knew each other back in the past, and both are single now, and they got engaged yesterday.
We'll run, Forrest, run. And we'll end on that love story, too. So, Kevin, thanks, man. This is awesome. Thank you so much. I hope I'll see you in a meeting in the near future. And if I do, I'll take you to dinner, and I'll put it on Mitch's credit card.
Yes. Excellent. Perfect. Right.
All right. Thank you guys for listening to this episode of the Fresh Flow Podcast. We'll see you next time. Thanks.